Good afternoon. You know, it's sobering to be inside the walls of a prison. But I have to say that most of the people outside at least have confidence that the people in here are in here for a good reason. We've been raised to believe that our criminal justice system almost never convicts an innocent person. And then, of course, we start to see that occasionally it does happen. Very rarely it does happen. But we chalk that up to innocent human error. After all, it is a human system, right? And our criminal justice system has an extensive appeals process that's designed to identify and correct any errors that may happen along the way. And so, despite the fact that everyone in prison claims that they're innocent, we know that most people are in prison because they've been convicted by a jury with evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. You know, sometimes that evidence is the victim or someone else has actually observed the crime, and they identify the perpetrator. You can't get evidence much better than that, right? Sometimes there are situations where a person confesses. That's pretty strong evidence as well. And so, you know, in all honesty, I'm not a lawyer, and I trust in the system. I believe that if the system has problems, the pros will fix them. Up until my husband, Jim Petro, served as Attorney General of Ohio, we both believed everything I just said. Now, we believe they're myths. In fact, we call them the 8 myths that convict the innocent and unfortunately allow true perpetrators to continue lives of crime.
Nearly a decade ago, I took office as Ohio Attorney General. And at the time, forgive me, I had voice training by Clint Eastwood. In taking office as Attorney General, I believed that there was very limited wrongful conviction. It really wasn't a problem. And really what I did believe in, though, was DNA. DNA had the power to protect citizens. When someone in prison had given up their DNA, there'd be a tracking then that could occur if crimes committed thereafter were actually committed by somebody who'd been in prison. In any event, I advanced the cause in the legislature to take the DNA of every convicted felon and first-degree misdemeanor and put it in both a state database and a national database. And with that, have the information we need to track people who committed subsequent crimes once they were released. I also understood that there might be people who legitimately professed innocence. And at that point, we needed to have a trigger, a mechanism, to actually have post-conviction DNA testing after they were convicted to try to, if there was DNA available, try to really confirm that they were guilty and not potentially innocent. And we enacted all of those laws and we worked with them. And I really began to realize that DNA was proving some opportunities for innocence as well as guilt. But it was about 3 years after I took office that I had a phone call one day from a very prominent state legislator down in Cincinnati, and he wanted to introduce me to the head of the Ohio Innocence Project. You may have heard about the Innocence Projects around the country, finding cases where they believe someone was wrongfully convicted. I got introduced over the phone to Mark Godsey, director of the Innocence Project, professor of law at Cincinnati. We got a chance to talk, and he told me about a man named Clarence Elkins. Clarence had been in prison for 8 years and had been convicted of murdering his wife, or excuse me, his mother-in-law, and raping his niece. And of course, here's a guy who's a good family man, 2 good sons, a wonderful wife who'd really been seeking his exoneration for years. No real reason to think this man would have committed this horrible crime. And so, as I looked into it further, I was asked to do so. I got our criminal justice staff involved. We came to believe that Clarence Elkins really was, based on DNA, absolutely innocent. And frankly, we're shocked that the prosecutor and the court ignored evidence that said there was male DNA at the crime scene and it wasn't Clarence's, and they felt that had no bearing on his ultimate conviction. That was crazy. And so suddenly I became involved in a case that I never thought I'd get involved in as an attorney general, arguing to acquit or to actually reverse a conviction and ultimately let a man go who'd been in prison. It took a while. It took about 3 or 4 months. Finally, we convinced the system that the proof was there, that somebody else did it, And this is the guy who should be in prison and not Clarence. It was after I left the legislature that I volunteered to be a pro bono lawyer with the Innocence Project. And in that service, encountered a lot of other things, including some of the myths that we see here. And up on the picture there, you'll see the guy in the check shirt is Clarence. All the way over here, Mark Godsey, probably the best lawyer I've ever known. It's been an honor to work with them. But clearly, I came to learn that there is wrongful conviction.
DNA not only proves that we do convict innocent people on a broader scope than most Americans would believe, but the study of those cases has enabled science-based recommendations on what we call reforms. I like to think of them as best practices. And we'd just like to take a moment to look at a couple of these myths a little bit more closely.
Let me talk about eyewitness, because it's, to me, the most prominent of the myths. 75% of those that have been proved to be wrongfully convicted were convicted solely on the testimony of an eyewitness. That's a remarkable thing, but the most significant point that I want to make, and we know this now because of DNA, beginning in 1989, the FBI began to track DNA taken from a victim that had been the victim of a sexual assault, typically a rape kit. They'd take the DNA, it was male DNA, obviously left there by the perpetrator, and then they matched it against the DNA of the individual who the victim said, as the eyewitness, using her own memory of the appearance of the perpetrator, that's the guy who committed the crime against me. Now, there was a time that, as you know, that witness sitting in the witness stand pointing at the defendant at the trial table and saying, that's the guy who raped me, that's the guy who committed the assault, there would have been no way a jury would acquit. They would convict. In this case, when the FBI did the matching, they determined that 25% of the time the match was incorrect. The perpetrator selected had not been the person who actually committed the crime based on the DNA proof. 25% error rate in 10,000 cases over 7 years, as reported by the FBI. That tracking has continued ever since. And with that tracking comes a recognition that the 25% error rate continues to this day. Prosecutors who rely solely on an eyewitness in a stranger-to-stranger crime have to understand that 25% of the time, the likelihood is that person is wrong. In cross-racial crimes, it can even be a greater percentage. It's an overwhelming number that makes you stand back and say, this is a significant flaw in our system. We have to do better.
You have the right to remain silent. There's probably no one in this room that isn't aware of our Miranda rights to remain silent and to have counsel in an interrogation. But would you be surprised that in a well-documented study of actual interrogations, 78% of the people waived their Miranda rights? This turns out to be a serious mistake, because when we look at the DNA-proven wrongful convictions, convictions of people who'd had absolutely nothing to do with the crime, 25% of them confessed, made self-incriminating statements, or pled guilty. There was a time in my life when I thought the only way that would happen is if someone would beat a confession out of me. Now I understand that most of the people in this room under certain circumstances would confess to a crime you didn't do. Some of these circumstances are, for example, you come to believe that it is in your best interests to plead guilty or confess. This happens perhaps because an average interrogation is 2 hours, but in these cases the average was 16.3 hours. Over the course of that interrogation, you can be told in this country, although it's illegal in England and is not practiced in Europe, you can be told false information about the evidence against you. For example, you failed the polygraph when you passed it. For example, your fingerprints were at the scene when they were not. For example, your buddy said that you were the trigger man, and you're not. And so it becomes extremely important that anyone who leaves here tells your children, if you're ever picked up for interrogation, be sure to get counsel.
There are reforms that can be undertaken that can change this. We've advocated for some in the Ohio legislature. Some have been adopted. Blind administration of eyewitness identification. There should be sequential administration of identification. We also were able to get, not mandatory, but we're working on it, videotape or audio tape recording of post-Miranda custodial interrogations. All of those kind of reforms can really make a difference, and we hope that'll occur. Honey, I'm going to wrap it up because we're down here. It was in 50 years ago that Justice John Marshall Harlan, in a concurring opinion, said that a fundamental value of our society is that it is far worse to convict an innocent person than to let a guilty man go free. In reality, and sadly, it's not an either-or proposition. For when we convict an innocent man, we do both. I thought I'd just